Yeah.
So it's trying to do enormous technology research and, in some ways achieving things. So this is a big kind of, I suppose, problem. Where can China go with an illiberal political environment where it's trying to be extremely creative in some areas, but it definitely doesn't want creativity in others? So
Welcome to the new Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Kerry Brown. Kerry is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College, London. Kerry is a leading China expert and the author of over 20 books on China. Today, Kerry and I, among other issues, will discuss his latest book, The Great Reversal, Britain, China, and the 400-Year Contest for Power. Kerry, welcome to the new Enlightenment.
thank you. Good to be here.
So your latest book is, as the title suggests, a history, a 400-year contest for power, specifically looking at the relationship between Britain and China. Why is it important that we look at the contemporary world we live in a historical perspective? Let's start there.
I think we'd all understand that we live in a period, because of social media, because of the way in which we're inflicted with information left, right, and center, that we're living in a sort of ultra-present time. Everything is now. And I think the other issue is that history itself has become an issue of, great contention and argument, wrapped up with things about our identity as particularly Europeans, people living in Britain. And, kind of for those two reasons, the fact that history itself is not an easy thing to navigate, and that we always tend to focus on the present and are a bit overwhelmed by the present, I thought in my own area, China, focusing on China studies, that I would try and combine an interest with history, my own experience dealing with this geography since 1991, and the fact that we're living in a vexed period with China where there's very, very fierce arguments about it being a threat, the Xi Jinping leadership being a problem, and Britain's role between America, China, two big argumentative powers. What can we do? I thought, well, there's one thing that Britain does have, and that is a pretty unique history with China as a European power and one closely allied for a long time with the US. So I thought, why don't I try and see what happened in the past at major inflection points? And so I spent a year sabbatical looking at the history I thought I knew, but I realized at the end of it, I didn't really know it, and trying to draw some patterns and conclusions to help navigate now. It was important to produce something that was accessible, that could be easily read. I could put in front of the lovely politicians, public figures, and other people that you have and I have to deal with, just to say, okay, this place that you kind of might feel is proposing terribly new and big problems in the present, actually, this is not a new story. We have been struggling with this for 400 years, and Europeans have been struggling with it for, longer, 600 or 700 years. So I kind of just felt this would be a kind of way of saying, we have a map for this. It's a bit of an old, folded, rusted over map, but we do have a map. There are ways in which we can use some of that. It's not totally relevant, but it's not irrelevant. And this might help telling that story, understanding where we've come from to be here today.
You mentioned early on in the book that if you look at China today, they know much more about the West and Western history. They send tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students to the West each year, not simply Britain, but to the United States, Canada, other parts of Europe, Australia, New Zealand. They learn English. But when it comes to our engagement with China, Chinese history, Chinese language, it's very limited. And in as much as you hear Mandarin here, if it's not a Chinese person visiting, it's a ethnic Chinese person that's a recent immigrant or a first generation. Aside from that, there's very little engagement with understanding Chinese history. And that creates a problem in that if we are entering a so-called new Cold War, and perhaps we can talk about this later, it pays to know who you're dealing with. And it seems that the Chinese know us. And I say us if, we're here in the West, as it were, and That's the new Cold War, if you like, but we don't know much about them. And that was a motivation I think you mentioned for writing the book. Can you say a bit more why we don't know more about China and why they know so much about us, or why they're interested, I would say, in knowing more about the West?
It is a big shift. It's a strange thing. Until recently, maybe 3 or 4 decades, um, it was the Europeans and the British that, on the whole, knew more about China. And the whole history from the beginning till the 1970s was mostly British, Europeans going to China, and then to some extent learning Chinese, knowing about China. We in our literature have a way earlier knowledge of China than China did about Britain. I think the earliest real references to Britain were quite late. At the end of the 18th century, there was this sort of understanding that there were these Europeans, and then there were these really nasty Europeans called British, and they were particularly antagonistic. And then, in the 19th century, I think it was Wei Yuan, a Chinese scholar, wrote a specific book about the differences in Europeans and the British in particular. He described, there wasn't really the same understanding and interest in the outside world as the outside world had in China, in the Qing particularly, up till 1911. As you just said, that's changed now. I mean, there are 200,000 Chinese students in Britain at the moment. There are, someone said, 200 million Chinese learning or speaking English. It's kind of a huge knowledge shift. And I suppose the kind of strange thing is that at the elite level in Britain, the elite universities and sinologists, there's always been a core, and that continues. And I don't know, their role today is a sort of strange role. I think sinologists in the past had a kind of slightly remote role. They were involved in a very, very kind of specific area of scholarship. And today, they're highly specialist. A lot of my colleagues in this field are highly specialist, but they also have a probably bigger function they ever did before publicly. But I wonder whether they are really equipped to deal with that a lot of the time, because there's still this tension between, well, we're specialists and we don't want to get involved with the grubby public discourse about that. So I think the way, not just that we understand China as China, but the way in which we talk about China amongst ourselves is also become quite difficult, quite kind of, I often feel like when I go to specialist conferences, I'm starting to speak some strange new dialect where I'm not entirely sure that I'm talking about China. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm not really kind of completely cognizant about what exactly it's got to do with the place I go and visit, lived in for a number of years. So I think the kind of knowledge about China too has changed, and the context of that knowledge. But you're absolutely right. We're in this unprecedented moment in which economically, geopolitically, militarily, China is a very different power than that which existed in the past. And our knowledge levels in the UK are not, I mean, basically not really up to where they should be. But I think we don't have an easy framework to talk about China. I mean, you can have a lot of knowledge about China and still not really be very sensible about the place. That's kind of perfectly possible. Whether we have much wisdom about the place is another matter. And that's extremely hard to get without, real lived experience there. And I have to say, in recent years, the fact that there's been lack of ability to go to China, I mean, I think some people in my field rightly say that it's very difficult to gather research information in China. The academic space there has been totally, kind of changed because of restrictions by the government, and that's not good. I went to China recently, about a month ago. I did it more for symbolic reasons. I feel it's important for people to go no matter what. We have to go, even if we know that we're being shown things we should be very skeptical about. But I understand completely that there is real problems with getting restricted, access, and that is not good. And no matter what the research that comes out of it, it's better to do it than not to do it. So I hope that changes soon.
Okay, so let's talk about that framework, and we can use your recent book which is history, focused on Britain and China, but obviously with lessons, I think, for anyone that's looking to understand China's place in the role and how that has changed over time and perhaps where it's going. You mentioned this also in the book, and I want to emphasize it not simply because his portrait is behind me, but Adam Smith discussed China in The Wealth of Nations, and it was of great interest to Smith and other Enlightenment thinkers because China was this very interesting yet closed and insular empire that had been, in comparison, fairly technologically advanced. But Smith discusses how China had reached this steady state, if you like, or this stagnation where it was neither growing nor was it declining. And that was kind of a puzzle, but there was that sense of it. And this was also before, I guess, China opened up. So using that, let's jump off from Smith perhaps into thinking about how do you place Britain's role in interaction with China, and then what is the role of China? So what is that history, and how does that lead to your framework for understanding them, or understanding China, excuse me?
In the Enlightenment, and obviously Adam Smith was writing in the 1760s, 1770s, kind of that period in Europe, the period of Voltaire, a little earlier, obviously Montesquieu, and earlier still Leibniz. I mean, these figures, the great kind of European figures of the Enlightenment, were interested, like Smith, in China and did write about China. Leibniz wrote, I think, 3 or 4 works about China. Like Smith, their sources were mostly European, mostly Jesuit missionaries who had lived in China and transmitted back information. Matteo Ricci from the very beginning of the 17th century, Adam Schmitz, people like this kind of sort of were transmitters. It was secondary. Not many people had physically been to China. I mean, of course, it was just a massive, massive journey that, kind of often ended up literally killing the people that went on it. So Smith, the fact that he had awareness of China, even if it was an indirect, was kind of interesting. Why did that appear? And in a lot of kind of cultural references to China in the 17th and 18th century, we get this sort of progress from, I think, quite a lot of idealization. The chinoiserie grew up. There was a sort of sense of these interesting products like silk and porcelain, and of course tea, coming from this strange remote place, and they were really, really novel and interesting, and people in Britain liked them. And then a kind of, sort of very, very idealized sense of what this place was. I mean, Goldsmith and others wrote kind of novels of an imaginary China. Samuel Johnson referred to it in the 1730s very approvingly. So it's interesting that Adam Smith himself kind of had this, kind of view of it as being an incredibly important economy, but very ancient and extremely passive. And, as you say, just sitting there, not really part of the great industrial revolution that was just really kicking off. And that view really did persist, and not just Smith, but decades later, one of the people that went in the 1790s on the great Macartney mission, the first real formal mission from Britain to China, led by Lord Macartney, a diplomat. One of the people on that, John Burrow, was a secretary to Macartney, and he wrote quite an influential book. In the Edinburgh Review, actually, he was a writer in literary magazines from the early 19th century. He disseminated these views, and the core point was China was an amazing place. He'd been there, unlike Smith. He'd actually seen the place, but it was just stuck in its history. It was not actually able to move into modernity. And that view was very, very powerful. I mean, I remember when I first dealt with China, in the 90s, someone told me that they lived in Hong Kong in the 50s, and then they kind of looked away in a sort of dreamy way and said, wow, how did they fall so far behind? I was always really interested in this idea of this China, being so stuck in the past. And of course, that's not the China we deal with today, which is rearing into the future. But it was a very long and persistent view that China was, kind of an idealized Oriental sort of other stuck way, way in the distant past. And it wasn't really contested that much. The only thing that I suppose really changed was this is a place that the British particularly felt that they needed to do something to pull into the modern world. And that mission obviously led to enormous amounts of violence and contention. But it was at the heart of this encounter between an active Britain that was about modernity and a China that Britain felt was about the past and about just resistance to change.
Well, then, is that view that was held during Enlightenment and thereafter? I mean, we've got restoring Smith's library, at least remnants thereof, or at least books that we knew he owned, and he had the complete library of Voltaire, his complete works, right? So Smith was reading, and when I have people here in Panmure House, I show them the breadth of his interests. And I would say, in today's world, social scientists, anthropologists, ethnographers, if you like, can go and do field work and they can interact. But we still should appreciate that the likes of Smith or David Hume or his other contemporaries in the Scottish as well as the European Enlightenment, they were doing, as you say, indirect empirical research trying to understand. But as you know, unless you're on the ground, you can get a particular, it has some kind of filter. But then in that case, you say it was idealized. Does that mean that it was inaccurate or just, was China as, let's say, stagnant or stuck in the past as we thought? Or what were the dynamics of China that then, as you mentioned, led to Britain in the 19th century increasingly wanting to engage and pull this ancient civilization into modernity?
So I think there are two dynamics going on there. One about what did people engaging with China really know about what was happening there? I mean, their encounters were very incomplete. There was only one place in China for a long time that foreigners could really go to, Canton, today's Guangdong. Obviously, that was the trading place, but everywhere else was pretty much closed most of the time. And it wasn't easy to learn Chinese. The first real success at learning Chinese by British people, Europeans did it earlier. I mean, Mattia Ricci obviously spoke fluent Chinese because he lived as a Chinese person, but that was very, very, very rare. British people, it was really only in the 19th century with Robert Morrison, who compiled the first dictionary of Chinese English. So it wasn't kind of there was the tools to understand what was going on. And subsequent researchers have found that, in China, there were massive complexities. The imperial court was one thing. The provincial government was always doing very different things. There were huge factional fights. I mean, we now know way more about this and how that impacted on the relationship with outsiders. So that was one thing. I think it's interesting to note, though, that idealism was pretty usually quite often followed by disillusionment quite quickly. Voltaire did write very approvingly about China in his early career, but as he got older, he started to become quite disillusioned and wrote more negative things, again, just about the idea that he had as a European of China. Kind of Samuel Johnson, towards the end of his life, Boswell wrote about how he also was wondering, how extraordinary it was that there was this great ancient empire and, kind of it had done these huge things, but what did it all really kind of mean? It seemed sort of very despotic. And you have, I think, with the whole kind of encounter between a power like Britain and China, and this has happened since many, many times, you have these honeymoons and then real disillusionment and the idea that China didn't live up to that original expectation. I think in people's personal encounter too, that I've often found that happens, that you get people go there very zealously. I mean, I probably was a bit like that. You go there and, everything is so different and amazing. And then it all gets very, very messy and you realize that it's different in ways that you don't really want it to be different. And I think that this is sort of a process. At the end of it, you hope to get to a more kind of balanced view. And I mean, that's been difficult to kind of really harmonize. I think that the reason why this history is important is we shouldn't be idealistic, of course, about China. But I mean, there are eras in the past in which we were, very negative and critical also weren't super helpful too. There was always this idea of a happy medium. And ironically, philosophically, between China and Britain, the idea of happy medium, the Aristotelian idea of happy medium and the Confucian idea of harmonious medium is probably one of the great common points, the great cultural common points. A happy medium is probably something we can both understand, both sides.
I mean, what you've just said is in many ways reflective of the current moment, right? So if the Enlightenment had this sort of idealized, interest in China and thought, well, this is ancient civilization. It's made so much progress, but it's stagnant. And, therefore there's so much potential. And then the question, why isn't engaged? And then, as you mentioned, then they kind of, that sense kind of decline. And I thought, there's wrong. And that's very much, I would say, reflects the last 20 years in terms of the West perception of China. As early on, there was hopes, the end of history, that China, as it embraced the global economy and became, key figure and key part of the global economy and opened up, that it would lead to more liberalization, both politically and economically. Those that traveling to China would see this amazing, rapid development, modernization, more and more Chinese nationals traveling and interacting as students, and then gives you that sense of there's we're moving in the positive direction. And now, just in the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, particularly with the kind of consolidation of power of Xi Jinping, and we'll come back to Xi, is that now we're entering again that sense of, oh, this is not what we expected of China. There's disappointment. There's much more concern. And that seems, if I'm correct, reflects how it was in the 18th century and I guess into the 19th century. So then that suggests that if we want to get to this happy medium, and I think that's what everyone is trying to figure out, is what is that happy medium? But then let's put that in context historically. So what happened in the 19th century going to 20th? Like, give a kind of encapsulate that history that you so eloquently kind of write about in your new book about Britain in that case. And we can use Britain as a proxy for the West in general, because I don't think it's significantly different. I mean, I guess there's different actors that come in, but let's say Britain is the proxy for China is engagement with the world.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, Britain was really at the forefront of processes which had to have an impact on China. I mean, the processes of technology, building a kind of global industry which had a global supply chain. I mean, like it or not, China was going to figure in that because it was a massive market, because it had things that Britain needed, in particular, somewhat prosaically, tea, but also other goods. You know, this kind of whole economic philosophy was going to have to figure out a way of dealing with this massive, massive population, a massive place, with things that a power like Britain needed, which, you know, kind of it wasn't going to play along with because of its political model. I mean, so that's not obviously unfamiliar to us today. China's political issues were very present for Victorian Britons. So basically, the Anglo-Chinese Wars, the Opium Wars as they're called in China, were principally about trying to enforce greater trade access to China in 1840 and then 1860, roughly, these wars. And Britain had way more in terms of technological access to violence. I mean, these were really violent attempts to get what Britain needed. And other Europeans got benefits from that. But they, in the end, by the 1860s, did open up China to huge amounts of Western influence. Britain was at the peak of its power from 1860 to 1900. We ran the Imperial Maritime Customs, which was really a Chinese ministry, but run by Europeans and principally British. Under Robert Hart, incredibly influential person, Northern Irish originally, who lived in China and was the head of the customs. It was about a third of fiscal revenue for the whole Chinese government, and that was collected from tariffs, you know, goods coming in and then distributed by this organization, relatively uncorrupt, relatively efficient, but still in the hands of, in effect, foreigners. So the 19th century really is the sort of peak of processes of industrialization in the hands of principally Europeans, principally British for most of it, that inevitably impacted on China. So, you know, in terms of culpability, there's plenty of ways in which you can say that Britain did have agency over what it did, of course. And, you know, there were many ways in which it was very conflicted over that. But it was itself in the thrall of these processes of globalization and, you know, trade globalization that meant that it kind of didn't have much option a lot of the time. It was needing all the time to find, you know, what we call the kind of contradictions of capitalism. It's never satiated, right? It has to keep on looking for things. And China was just too important and big to opt out of that. And also, finally, there was plenty of reasons why, you know, the Qing and the Chinese state, which was greatly unstable, but it had an incentive to engage with these because they were products, you know, producers of, you know, growth and economic strength for it. So it was a very messy period. I think what is interesting about Britain's approach is it did not want a second India. The India empire, as it was part of the British Empire by 1857, was an enormous draw on fiscal resources by the British state, and it was regarded very negatively, despite all the nostalgia today by some. Actually, Palmerston and people like that regarded the whole thing as being an awful mess. Disraeli was the one who really kind of sanitized it and thought it was a good thing by making Queen Victoria the Empress of India, for that was all sort of showmanship. Fiscally, it was a big, big drain. And there was enormous amount of attempt to stop China becoming like that. Britain would maybe have been able to dominate in ways it did in India, but it didn't want to because of the enormous costs that would have involved. And so this informal empire set up, which was probably the worst of all worlds, because it was Britain having lots of power and no responsibility, and China having no responsibility, kind of no real power, but lots of responsibility. And it ended up as a kind of, obviously a huge, huge mess. And the Qing collapse in 1911, maybe for many other reasons, but obviously the impact of this was a contributing factor.
Already in the 18th century in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, and in the revisions, speaks of his kind of didn't think that colonialism was necessarily good, or at least retaining control over colonial possessions was an economically sound thing. So he was very much of the mind that we'll let the American colonies kind of do their thing. That advice wasn't taken on in the 19th century, clearly with the colonization of India. I'm curious, though, in many contemporary debates on colonialism, and I know this has become a difficult conversation to have, unfortunately. I think we should be open to discussing it. But the colonial encounter is always, at least in the contemporary sense, treated as a one-way street, that it's always violent, it's always met with resistance. Typically, when you open the box and look in, it's much more difficult to necessarily say that it's just one-sided. Usually, there's many political dynamics within the colonized place is such that there's different factions, and the saying goes as though Britain was always divide and conquer and the like, and just I think partly true. But curious, as you mentioned in the Chinese case, what was the agency on the part of the Chinese, the Qing dynasty, in terms of, I don't want to use the word welcoming Britain, but interacting with Britain in a way that it was in their interest to do so, or what were the dynamics of how China saw Britain at that time and that opening up, if you like?
It's interesting, in the very early period, beginning of the 19th century till about the middle of the 19th century, there were a very small group, they were called the Hongs, the kind of Chinese merchants. They were meant to be 12 of them, but they were usually slightly less, who became fabulously wealthy through their trade monopoly with mostly British merchants. And so, these kind of super, super, super wealthy sort of Qing era business people definitely got plenty of benefit from engagement with foreigners. And the government got benefit because that was the conduit through which wealth from these foreigners came into China. I mean, the problem was that in some ways, the benefit for China and the reasons why that they saw value in having any trade with foreigners was because it was massively lucrative, and the deficits in their favor were huge. That was one of the great tragic reasons for the Opium Wars and the opium kind of problem, because British could not sell anything to the Chinese in return for tea and other things they needed. The amount of tea that Britain took from China was massive, increasingly massive from the 1780s. There was a new tax in 1784 that I think made, kind of smuggling basically into contraband trade with tea disappear. Just a very modest 12% tax, hugely beneficial because it regularized the trade. And China then became really important as the source. So, kind of what British traders couldn't do, some of them indeed from Scotland, Jardine, Matheson, people like this, they were always looking as private traders, not part of the East India Company, but private traders who could do trade between India and China. They were looking at the only thing that could really balance this trade and sell to the Chinese was opium. And so, this kind of was really because of the success of the Chinese government in making massive, massive money out of exporting, but it just didn't want to import. We have this problem today.
I was just going to say,
it's not
history repeating.
It's always really, and it's also very odd today that China is now obviously kind of accused of being involved in manufacturing of fentanyl and things like this. It's these tropes kind of reappear in very different ways, but they still reappear. I mean, the imbalances, because of the success of the Qing court in exporting, were to become its biggest problem. As the 19th century went on, in fact, as it became more unstable, in fact, again, ironically, its biggest support in surviving ended up being Britain. I mean, in 1864, after the massive Taiping Rebellion, which nearly destroyed the Qing, I mean, kind of 25 million died. It was just a massive, massive, tragic event. This was ultimately resolved with quite a bit of help from the British, not decisively. There were Chinese generals who won the battles mostly, but certainly Britain supported the Qing against the Taiping and wanted it to continue in power. And Britain was not happy when the Qing collapsed in 1911. I mean, it wanted a stable partner that was not too strong and not too weak. That fitted it fine. And China, of course, the ruling elite, were happy to get what they could from Britain. In the end, of course, had to rely on a partner like Britain when they were really beset. So it was a very complicated, kind of twisted, contorted relationship. But you're right, it wasn't one in which you can say one side was wholly bad, one side was wholly good. It was really complicated and a real big mess. But the irony is today, of course, that story in China is very simplified. It's basically that the British were, evil, bad, like the colonizers, all other colonizers. It was a century of humiliation. That's a story I've heard many, many times. And it has a neatness about it, a moral elegance about it. But I really wanted to understand as a British person, well, is that really what happened? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to think about this history and try and get some insight into it. And the conclusion, of course, was it was way more complicated than that, way, way more complicated.
That simplified story fits nationalists' agenda to kind of mythologize history and make China out to be always the victim of external forces, and therefore we must rise up and defend ourselves, which, I mean, nationalists the world over, that's what they do, mythologize these histories or take components of it to create a simplified kind of victim ideology. Let's talk about that was the 19th century. So we've gone from the Enlightenment, 18th century to 18th century now, 19th century. What was, post 1911 what changed the dynamic then, right? I mean, the British Empire itself was, undergoing flux. America already by the 20th century was clearly overshadowing Britain economically, and the dynamics of the global political economy was changing. So Britain's role was changing, but then China was still closed in effect in a certain way. The Japanese empire was growing and strong. What was that kind of early 20th century story, and then how did that develop over the
The most important thing in the 20th century was the rise of Chinese nationalism itself. And that was an import into China. I mean, the idea of a nation and defending a nation, having national identity, these are not things one sees in Chinese political philosophy before the end of the 19th century. But Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, two figures particularly, who had influence over the then emperor, the Guangxu emperor, I mean, they kind of articulated for Chinese a sense of, who are we? What are we about? What are our values? And that really kind of fired some domestic movements. The 100-Day Reform of 1898 didn't work. The reactionaries, the conservatives in the Qing court closed that down, basically imprisoned the emperor. But in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion, quite violent uprising, was, I suppose, the first real manifestation of this sort of fairly muscular Chinese nationalism. And I have to say, as the 20th century goes on, till today, Chinese nationalism has always been unsettling for British and other foreigners. We don't really know quite what it is. It seems to have some kind of bite. We know what Japanese nationalism looked like in the Second World War. We saw that very fearsomely and powerfully. But Chinese nationalism is a less sort of easy thing to pin down. It has kind of real sort of sporadically, it had real impact. A lot of the British response to its declining power in China and globally, but in China, was to sort of really try and work out how do we deal with these strange movements that are appearing, the nationalist movement and then the communist movement, these different sorts of movements. And so by the 90s, you had this sort of weird situation that Britain is still really significant in China. Most investment from abroad is British. Britain had lots of consular posts. It was still a significant power, but it was accommodating with Americans, Japanese, Russians, others, and having to sort of create a new sort of space for it. The largest military action that Britain ever undertook in China was, ironically, in the mid-1920s, when there were kind of uprisings against British interests in central China. And it sent in, something like 20,000 troops, way more than fought in the Anglo-Chinese wars. However, it wasn't that Britain had a real kind of power at that time. It was really having to work in concert with others. And of course, when the Second World War started, or the Sino-Japanese War from 1937, I mean, this completely changed the terrain. It was an incredible existential moment for China, but also for Britain. Its kind of role from that point was a very, very different one. It marked, of course, the appearance of the United States as the key power in Asia from the 1940s, after, being more distant and less willing to be involved. And I guess we still live in that period today. It completely changed the paradigm. So the 20th century, you could say, was one of a slow retreat. That's Britain's story in many places, but in China, it really was a slow retreat over decades.
I'm curious, can you say more about Chinese nationalism? So if you like nationalism, the idea of a nation state is a European construct, if anything, the ideas about it empirically, I mean, in the late 19th century, the kind of emergence of nation states in Europe. And so those ideas were flowing around the globe. And I'm curious if the two thinkers that you mentioned, were they borrowing these ideas from Europe? Or was it, where's the balance between the Chinese form of nationalism and how it kind of fits with the Western idea of the nation state? And you suggest that there's, and again, even still to this day, what is Chinese nationalism? So how have these what has that developed, the idea of Chinese nationalism, and what is it?
Sure. I think the philosophy of nationalism was definitely an import from the outside world. The idea of a nation, what is a nation state with borders and a kind of defined entity. You would say in Chinese history, it was not really something that was present. There was an idea of civilizational influence, and lots of people have written about this. It's a different kind of idea of what the political unit is. Really more a cultural unit and having cultural influence, and that was the main thing, that the imperial Chinese dynasties, had zones around them of varying intensity where their cultural influence was more important. Of course, the modern state isn't like that. So I think that it was kind of a combination of trying to modernize Chinese thinking about these issues, but also asking this question, what are the Chinese? What's their culture? What are their values? And you got people looking, for instance, like I mentioned, Kang Youwei, trying to really say, oh, Confucianism is what we've historically believed in. And it's not just for Chinese, there's a universal Confucianism, right? So I guess Chinese nationalism from the very beginning was this, almost like have your cake and eat it. It was, we are very specific. We have a very specific history. We have a very specific cultural outlook. But we can also say that we have a sort of applicability to the whole world. We can be both local and global. We are not kind of buying into this idea that to be global, to, kind of believe that there is this thing called global universal values. There was a pushback against the Enlightenment West from very, very early on, the idea that we are not subscribing to your identity and your values. You must accept us as we are as Chinese, even though we completely respect your universal values. This very complicated kind of dynamic, which continues today. I suppose, though, for Chinese nationalism, there was always a massive political use to it. And for politicians in China, the nationalists and then the communists, if they could control this area, then they could control power. And so, people like Sun Yat-sen, the father of Chinese nationalism in a way, he's the great ideologue, and he wrote the three principles of peace, people's, kind of the three principles of the people, the idea of democracy and the idea of culture, the idea of, sort of the harmony amongst different kinds of ethnic groups in China, creating a cohesive unit. That obviously continues to today. The idea that China is unified in its cultural understanding, even though it's extremely diverse within itself, these were all very, very early parts of the idea of the kind of ideology of nationalism in China. But what you can certainly say is that from the early 20th century, in the abstract, had a massive impact in politics in China and in creating, mobilization for different groups, which ended ultimately in the victory of the communists in 1949 because of their control of a lot of this nationalistic discourse.
Because that was my next question: is how has the Communist Party of China taken that mantle of nationalism around China and made it their own, and how do they perpetuate it today? Right? I mean, I just saw a headline this morning about how Chinese nationalism has led to increased violence against foreigners in the country, and so nationalism is dangerous. But how has the CCP taken that? And then we'll come to this. I would like is there's also the Republic of China, also known as Taiwan, who have a different view of Chinese history. They claim to be the protectors of Chinese history. All traditional Chinese characters are in use. But then, as we know, Taiwan has embraced a more liberal view of politics and embraced democracy, but still maintain that they're ethnically Chinese and still grounded in Chinese history and culture. So how then, to make that a simple question, how has the CCP taken Chinese nationalism, shaped it to be their own, and how do they perpetuate that today?
So the communists were very confusing to foreign observers as they came to power. I think the British were less committed than the Americans to the idea that the communists were just a marginal group. I mean, we did try and work out a bit in the 1940s about who were this sort of bandit group that was suddenly becoming quite influential. Many people didn't think they would come to power when, in fact, during the Civil War, they ultimately did. And, a lot of thought was about, okay, these are a group who are really in the pay of the USSR. They're kind of servants of Moscow. People realize, no, that's not true. Actually, they are very distinctive. First, the two things about them which were distinctive was, one, they were more agrarian, more based obviously in the countryside than in proletariat sort of cities. And two, highly nationalistic. They kind of had a very distinct and strong view of almost this spiritual thing called China. And within this massive idea of China, there was enormous issues around history. The communists had a narrative of history as being one of injustice and class struggle that was resulting finally in, kind of justice for those who'd been oppressed during that long, long history, both within China and against the mean foreigners, but also a kind of idea of ethnic harmony, because to be Chinese wasn't really an ethnic kind of title. There were the Han Chinese and then the 55 other ethnic minorities officially, though you could argue there were many, many more, and kind of creating this amazing sort of imagined community, I suppose you'd call it, of people who were Chinese principally and then had some other identity kind of added, Tibetan, Mongolian, things like this. So it was an extremely kind of complicated idea. But at heart, I think its impact for the communists was very emotional. It was really, we have been through a history as a community, as a chosen people, in a way, as a sort of people who should have been treated better because of our great culture, suffered badly in modern history. And now, with the communists as a sort of almost a revivalist spiritual movement, we are going to be resurrected as a great people. And under Xi Jinping, I think that's really come to a head, because it's this idea of China now having its renaissance, as it's called in the country, it has been in recent years, its moment of rejuvenation. It's finally risen from the flames of this terrible, unjust history. So these are quite potent messages. I mean, we can deconstruct them, of course, we can argue against them, but they're very potent for many Chinese people, whether they like the Communist Party or they often don't. As for, the role of foreigners and the tax on foreigners, I mean, that's been a constant thing from the 19th century. The role of foreigners in China is often a very ambiguous one. And I always noticed it when I was there. I have to say, in my 40, no, 30, 34 years in dealing in China, living in China, I think there was one time in that whole time that I had an unpleasant interaction with someone on the street that was maybe kind of racist. I mean, because I was white. I have to say the rest of the time, never, ever, ever, even in conversations about how mean and horrible British were in the past, I have to say it never kind of really became, to me, personal. I always was really impressed by that. And I kind of know in recent years, Chinese students in Britain, that's not been so benign. I mean, there's some really unpleasant interactions. So I think in some ways I'm really impressed by that. But the public rhetoric about foreigners in China can sometimes be
Uh,
very, very kind of different. So I think the public rhetoric has always been a difficult thing to deal with. Our role in the history of the development of modern China is one where we don't have a good position. And that's why I think it's important that we know our history. So we can certainly be respectful of Chinese emotions and views. But to be honest, our history is not so straightforward in China. Many of the actors in the height of imperialism, Lord Elgin, Charles Elliot, the real meanies, privately were very conflicted about what they were doing and how they were trying to achieve aims, and they didn't often have a clue what to do, and they kind of didn't do the right thing maybe, but it wasn't because they were existentially evil.
uh,
It was because I think they were just kind of completely frustrated. So that's a slightly different way of kind of understanding their motives. They certainly wrote a lot about how conflicted and a lot of time sympathetic to what was happening in China. But in the end, they were extremely self-interested and continued to do what they needed to. They felt they needed to. So it doesn't get off the hook, but it is, in a sense, a kind of, some explanation for why they acted in the way they did.
you have a book behind you, another book. Your new one also is, I see there on the shelf. This one with a nice gilding, gold, but one on Xi Jinping, who is consolidated his power. There's been a bit of a purge that's happened among the elites. He's clearly concerned about Chinese globalization and the penetration of foreign ideas. I mean, banning effectively private schools or, private education providers. See, there's a closing up of China. What do we need to understand about Xi and the CCP and what's transpired in the last, say, 5 years, and how that reinforces, I would say, a perception in the West that we're very far from this happy medium. And in part, that's because of what Xi Jinping has done or is doing
Mm.
in relation to the openness of China, as it were, both economically and politically and culturally. And you mentioned earlier how, sinologists, the difficulty of going to China and just doing research on China, and likewise the comfort that Chinese nationals have of just speaking out, even in private,
Mm.
on what is happening in China and where they're going. And so where does Xi, how do we need to understand Xi? I know that's a big question. We need probably another 3-4 hours to discuss
Indeed.
that, but
Well, I mean, I think Xi Jinping is the product of two things. One is us and one is within China. I think in 2008, the great economic crisis, it really removed a lot of the idealism that Chinese had about the West. We talked earlier about Western idealism about China, but in some ways it's been more than reciprocated. There has been great idealism about the West in the past few decades. And when I first went to China in the 1990s, when I was a diplomat there in the 2000s, there was a kind of lot of respect for Western models and feeling, well, we need to kind of really understand these, a lot of research about them. But I think in 2008, that kind of went. 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and what happened in Russia afterwards, rightly or wrongly, that was attributed to, kind of Western influence and the attempt of Westerners to sort of try and have Russia become, more like the political West. I think China saw this as a big, big disaster, economically and in terms of Russia's stability. And they've regarded 2008, I think, as also a sign that the West weren't even good capitalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that had a big impact and led to the more nationalist leadership we see today, because there was an idea that China had to take its own way and be more confident and stand on its own 2 feet. I think domestically also, it's inevitable when China becomes the world's second biggest power, economically, it has the capacity to do things. It can't just sit there passively. And that needed a kind of spokesperson and someone to ensure that the Communist Party wasn't just this massive corrupt business, which it kind of became in the 2000s. So I think Xi Jinping is the restoration of the Communist Party as a political entity, which is remorselessly focused on its own survival. And I mean, he's in power because the Communist Party has to remain in power and largely thinks without a unified leadership like his, then that's not going to happen. If you have a weak leadership or a more dispersed leadership, you are more vulnerable. This is a massive project. This is not where the stakes are low. That's the problem, that China's success in this form is a big problem for the West. I understand that. I completely get that. But the problem is China's failure is probably a bigger problem for the West, right? So
Yeah.
when I hear my dear colleagues in America go on about going for regime change in China, I think, well, what does a China look like that is going to be a bit like, maybe in the Middle East or Afghanistan or places where we've tried to take responsibility to tell others how to govern themselves, and that hasn't gone great. I mean, the British experience of China over the last 400 years shows that we weren't really very helpful at trying to work out how the Chinese govern themselves, to be absolutely honest with you. I'm not saying it was right or wrong that Britain tried to do the things it did, just saying that the outcomes were never very happy. And so I'm deeply, deeply, I suppose, skeptical about whether we will have a great deal of use in telling China how to sort its problems out. But I don't deny that the problems are massive. And as you said earlier, it's a great pity today. It's a huge pity that at a time, in fact, on big things where the West and China probably agree, global warming, things like that. I mean, we kind of agree. AI, massive problems with AI. I think it's a real pity, actually a tragedy, that we don't have better dialogue. And that's the fault of both sides.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying that it's, China's fault. China has made plenty of mistakes. And I also don't think it's wholly the West's fault. We didn't lose China. But I think it's, really a tragedy for all of us that there isn't better dialogue. And when I go to China, I mean, people berate me for going. I had someone put a weird comment on X, formerly known as Twitter, yesterday about Kerry Brown goes and does appeasement in China, all this nonsense. I mean, I think it's just important for me to go and say, actually, you need more people like me to come. You need people with opinions you don't like.
Yes.
Not like me. You need people to come, because that's crucial to actually just having a dialogue and making sure we understand each other and understand what we don't understand.
I think, going to China and engaging with the Chinese, that doesn't make one an apologist to China. I mean, there are apologists out there for sure, but I do as well get uncomfortable with the kind of saber rattling vis-a-vis China, where it's, Adam Smith has a section in the Wealth of Nations where he basically says, we should not envy the success of other nations. We should actually be happy for other nations, as he puts it, and their success and their growth. And we shouldn't do things to stymie that growth. And I think that's useful to remember that, the modernization of China and what it has become is nothing to be, we shouldn't envy them, but we shouldn't be critical of that development. We should actually be happy that China has done that. And I think we're losing sight of that, where now it seems like, no, we want to, or some of the suggestions of, and it's bipartisan in the United States that, they want to almost see China decline. And I don't think that's a good thing. I mean, I do think there's real reasons to be concerned about, technology and, use and military technologies. I think there's reasons to be
Yeah.
concerned from a corporate espionage perspective and also from a national security perspective. I mean, this is all still there, but at the same time, it's you know healthy, vibrant China is good. But I do think, and this is the liberal in me, and this is what I respect about Taiwan is that they have demonstrated that they you can be ethnically Chinese and still
Yeah.
embrace the values of liberalism. And a question I pose, China's made rapid strides. It is innovating, but I do wonder how, the limits of authoritarian context where freedom of expression is constrained, where individual liberty, and I do think that's important for creativity, is not embraced, right? I mean, you can do a lot in terms of catch-up development, and the Soviets were very good at also, advancing technologically to a certain degree, but I always feel like there's limits. And I mean, I do think there's something to be said about a free society. Sometimes we don't
Mm.
have enough of a free society here in the West, and I include Britain and Europe and North America. And, there's increasing illiberalism and illiberal tendencies here as well. I do think there's value in a free society for creativity and expression. And, I think just looking at Britain, Britain might look like it's declining, but we still have some of the best universities in the world. Britain still exports cultural products, film, music, the arts, and is also, still contributing to technological innovation. There's a lot. And yeah, in as much as there are too many potholes here in Scotland and England, and, we can debate why that's the case. But there's still a sense of, this ability to be creative. Now, that's not to say that you cannot be creative and open in China. But again, I do feel in looking at the East Asian context, looking at South Korea and how they export cultural products, and in addition to exporting phones and, industrial goods and the like, how, where are the limits then to what this kind of closing of Chinese kind of freedom of expression in as much as it existed?
That's a huge question. I was
Yes.
reading in the 1980s, I've forgotten the author, the closing of the American mind. You probably remember this.
Jonathan Haidt.
That's right. And I was thinking with this criticism that, basically, even in the 90s, there were problems that universities weren't teaching and then I read a book recently about how in Britain, universities have kind of really, they're no longer into free thinking. They're kind of very regulated. And I say, so this criticism, this self-criticism is obviously quite persistent. I mean, I think for, there's two big things, I guess, questions that China raises. Well, three, I suppose. One is that it's trying to create creativity with a very, very restricted political framework. So it's trying to do enormous technology research and, in some ways, achieving things. So this is a big kind of, I suppose, problem. Where can China go with an illiberal political environment where it's trying to be extremely creative in some areas, but it definitely doesn't want creativity in others? So I think that's one big question. And as of today, it's kind of achieving some things, but I mean, in the long term, who knows? So this is why I think it's a big challenge for the philosophy of liberalism, because it's really trying to contest that. The second, I suppose, is what is different about today than in the past for us in the political West or anywhere outside China is it is no longer us going there, which was the story until very recently. It is China coming here through students, but that's kind of the more benign and tangible side. But it's also what you say about cyber and internet, and that's unsettling. It might be completely benign, it might be completely unproblematic, but it's new. So companies from China, they're new. China doing technology that impacts on us, that's not happened before, not until the, porcelain and things like that in the past, in the distant past. But in recent modern decades, no, that's not happened. So these are sort of really weird kind of changes that we don't have an easy paradigm for. But I think finally, more positively, the history of Britain and Europeans and Americans with China, and North Americans, most foreigners with China. It's been one of collaboration, actually, and people-to-people links, and they have, on the whole, overwhelmingly been positive. I mean, I always think when I go to China, I'm going to a big school. I'm learning all the time. I'm always amazed. I mean, last time I was there, I learned many things, but I did learn that a robot can make terrible coffee. I had a robot serve me in Shenzhen. It made awful coffee. It made a terrible mess, but it was kind of really amazing, this octopus-like thing, kind of making this damn coffee. And I don't know whether they programmed it, like with a British barista sort of, surly face when it looked at me, because it had a little face on it, but it
Right.
didn't look happy when it was giving me this awful coffee. And I felt at home.
Yes. Well, there's
So
the
I
limits to
think this sort of
robotics. Yeah.
sense of creative collaboration, even when it was really, really tough, is important. And the final thing really is that no matter how hard the history was for 100 years, we never stopped talking to each other. We never, ever stopped talking to each other. And things were really bad in the past sometimes. 1967, the British legation in Beijing was burnt to the ground, right? So we did have tough times, but we never stopped talking. So I suppose, though it's a tough time at the moment, well, I think we can still carry on talking.
Well, I think that is I could continue talking to you for hours, I think, about China, but I think that's actually a useful message to finish off with, is that, again, and I say that, Adam Smith's portrait is behind me, but, what was characteristic of the Scottish Enlightenment was that they continued to have conversations. I mean, just here in Edinburgh, difficult topics about difficult issues, and they persisted. And we should do that in international relations with China. Kerry Brown, new book is The Great Reversal, and you have many books as well on China. So there's many to be had. Hope this is not the last time you're on the podcast, and I hope to welcome you in person to Panmure House at some time in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.